The White Nile is a river in Africa, the minor of the two main tributaries of the Nile, the larger being the Blue Nile. The name white comes from the clay sediment carried in the water that changes the water to a pale color. In the strict meaning, White Nile refers to the river formed at Lake No, at the confluence of the Bahr-al-Jabal and Bahr-al-Ghazal rivers. In the wider sense, White Nile refers to all the stretches of river draining from Lake Victoria through to the merger with the Blue Nile, the Victoria Nile from Lake Victoria via Lake Kyoga to Lake Albert, then the Albert Nile to the South Sudan border, and then the Mountain Nile or Bahr-al-Jabal down to Lake No. White Nile may sometimes include the headwaters of Lake Victoria, the most remote of which being 3,700 kilometers 2,300 miles from the Blue Nile. White Nile River, section of the Nile between Malakal, South Sudan, and Khartoum, Sudan. It is formed by the confluence of the Mountain Nile, Bahr-al-Jabal, and the Sobat River above Malakal, and it flows for about 500 miles, 800 kilometers, northeast and north past Al-Rank, Kusti, Railway Bridge, Al-Duwaim, and Jabal al-Ali, irrigation dam, to join the Blue Nile at Khartoum and form the Nile proper. This wide and shallow section of the river runs placidly along a small slope and is frequently fringed with swamps. The total length of the White Nile, including its major tributary, the Mountain Nile, is 1,295 miles, 2,084 kilometers. During flood, June, September, the river provides less than 30% of the main Nile flow at Khartoum because the force of the floodwaters of the Blue Nile holds back the White Nile, turning it into a lake. At low water, April, May, the White Nile's flow is uninhibited, and its contribution is more than 80% of total volume. The river is navigable all year by river steamer. The White Nile is one of the two major tributaries to the famous Nile River, the other one being the Blue Nile. The White Nile is a very important river for South Sudan, but it is not exclusive to this country. All in all, the White Nile flows through 6 different countries: DRC, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. Sometimes the term White Nile is used to refer only to the river formed at Lake No in South Sudan, where the rivers Bahr-al-Jabal and Bahr-al-Ghazal join each other. Normally, the term White Nile is used in broader sense and denotes all stretches of the river draining from Lake Victoria to the confluence with the Blue Nile. When there is a need to separate these stretches from each other, they are called Victoria Nile, via Lake Kyoga to Lake Albert, Albert Nile, from Lake Albert to the South Sudan border, and Mountain Nile/Bahr-al-Jabal, from the border to Lake No. The most remote of the Lake Victoria headwaters are situated about 3,700 kilometers from the Blue Nile. From the point where the White Nile enters South Sudan at the Ugandan border, it is commonly referred to as the Mountain Nile, or Bahr-al-Jabal in Arabic. This name is used until the river enters Lake No in South Sudan. From Lake No and onward, it is only known as the White Nile until it joins the Blue Nile in the Republic of Sudan to form the Nile. The river enters South Sudan by the town Nemule at the border to Uganda. It flows through central Equatoria, which until the mid-2000s was named Bahr-al-Jabal after the river. The river then has to go through several rapids before it gets down to the Sudan plain. Lake No is located where the Bahr-al-Jabal River joins the Bahr-al-Ghazal River, north of the Sud Swamp. When the river reaches this point, it has traveled approximately 1,155 kilometers from Uganda's Lake Albert, the previous major lake on the White Nile. After Lake No, the river is not called Bahr-al-Jabal anymore, it is only known as the White Nile from this point. The Sud Swamp is a large wetland area, fed by the White Nile and also by Bahr-al-Ziraf, an anabranch river that left the Bahr-al-Jabal upstream, before Lake No. From Lake No, the White Nile flows eastwards to the mouth of the Sobat River, a journey of approximately 120 kilometers. This area only slopes very gently, so the river runs at a slow speed and the area is characterized by swamps and lagoons. When the Sobat River empties into the White Nile, it brings with it a lot of sediment that contributes greatly to the White Nile's white-grayish appearance. Just north of the White Nile's confluence with the Sobat River is Malakal, South Sudan's second largest city and the home of the country's only international airport outside the capital. From Malakal, the White Nile continues to run at a leisurely pace, but this stretch is not swampy. After leaving South Sudan, the White Nile continues through the Republic of Sudan all the way to the country's capital Khartoum, where it merges with the Blue Nile to form the Nile. The 19th century search by Europeans for the source of the Nile was mainly focused on the White Nile, which disappeared into the depths of what was then known as Darkest Africa. Course. Headwaters. The Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria near the Tanzanian town of Bukoba, is the longest feeder river for Lake Victoria, although sources do not agree on which is the longest tributary of the Kagera, and hence the most distant source of the Nile. The source of the Nile can be considered to be either the Ruvi Iranza, which emerges in Bururi province, Burundi, near Bukarezaz, or the Nyabarongo, which flows from Nyungwe forest in Rwanda. These two feeder rivers meet near Rusumo Falls on the border between Rwanda and Tanzania. These waterfalls are known for an event on 28 to 29 April 1994, when 250,000 Rwandans crossed the bridge at Rusumo Falls into Ngara, Tanzania, in 24 hours, in what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees called the largest and fastest refugee exodus in modern times. The Kagera forms part of the Rwanda, Tanzania and Tanzania-Uganda borders before flowing into Lake Victoria. The White Nile in Uganda goes under the name of Victoria Nile from Lake Victoria via Lake Kyoga to Lake Albert, and then as the Albert Nile from there to the border with South Sudan. The Victoria Nile starts at the outlet of Lake Victoria, at Jinjia, Uganda, on the northern shore of the lake. Downstream from the Nyaljabal power station and the Kira power station at the outlet of the lake, the river goes over Bujagali Falls, the location of the Bujagali power station, about 15 kilometers 9.3 miles downstream from Jinjia. The river then flows northwest through Uganda to Lake Kyoga in the center of the country, thence west to Lake Albert. At Karuma Falls, the river flows under Karuma Bridge at the southeastern corner of Murchison Falls National Park. During much of the insurgency of the Lord's Resistance Army, Karuma Bridge, built in 1963 to help the cotton industry, was the key stop on the way to Gulu, where vehicles gathered in convoys before being provided with a military escort for the final run north. In 2009, the government of Uganda announced plans to construct a 750 megawatt hydropower project several kilometers north of the bridge, which was scheduled for completion in 2016. The World Bank had approved funding a smaller 200 megawatt power plant, but Uganda opted for a larger project, which the Ugandans will fund internally if necessary. Just before entering Lake Albert, the river is compressed into a passage just 7 meters wide at Murchison Falls, marking its entry into the western branch of the East African Rift. The river then flows into Lake Albert opposite the Blue Mountains in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The stretch of river from Lake Kyoga to Lake Albert is sometimes called the Kyoga Nile. The river draining from Lake Albert to the north is called the Albert Nile. It separates the West Nile sub-region of Uganda from the rest of the country. A bridge passes over the Albert Nile near its inlet in Nebai district, but no other bridge over this section has been built. A ferry connects the roads between Adjumani and Moyo, and navigation of the river is otherwise done by small boat or canoe. From the point at which the river enters South Sudan from Uganda, the river goes under the name of Mountain Nile. From Lake No in South Sudan the river becomes the White Nile in its strictest sense, and so continues northwards into Sudan where it ends at its confluence with the Blue Nile. From Nemul in South Sudan, close to the border with Uganda, the river becomes known as the Mountain Nile or Bahr-al-Jabal, literally mountain river or river of the mountain. The southern Sudanese state of Central Equatoria through which the river flows was known as Bahr-al-Jabal until 2006. The southern stretch of the river encounters several rapids before reaching the Sudan Plain and the vast swamp of the Sud. It makes its way to Lake No, where it merges with the Bahr-al-Ghazal and there forms the White Nile. An anabranch river called Bahr-al-Ziraf flows out of the Bahr-al-Jabal and flows through the Sud, to eventually join the White Nile. The mountain Nile cascades through narrow gorges and over a series of rapids that includes the Fola rapids. To some people, the White Nile starts at the confluence of the mountain Nile with the Bahr-al-Jabal at Lake No. The 120 kilometers of White Nile that flow east from Lake No to the mouth of the Sobat are very gently sloping and hold many swamps and lagoons. When in flood, the Sobat River tributary carries a large amount of sediment, adding greatly to the White Nile's pale color. From South Sudan's second city Malakal, the river runs slowly but swamp-free into Sudan and north to Khartoum. Downstream from Malakal lies Khadak, the site of the 1898 Fashoda incident that marked an end to the scramble for Africa. In Sudan the river lends its name to the Sudanese state of White Nile, before merging with the larger Blue Nile at Khartoum and forming the River Nile. The White Nile is a navigable waterway from the Lake Albert to Khartoum through Jebel Alia Dam. Only between Juba and Uganda requires the river upgrade or channel to make it navigable. During part of the year the rivers are navigable up to Gambela, Ethiopia, and Wau, South Sudan. Thank you for watching this video.